Well, welcome to this Interact in Conversation session. And today we're going to be talking about job crafting. For those who don't know me, I'm Professor Jill MacBryde. I'm based at Strathclyde University in the Business School there. But for the last 4 years, I've been co-director of the Interact Network, which is part of UKRI's Made Smarter Innovation programme. And Made Smarter Innovation is really all about trying to accelerate digital transformation within the manufacturing sector. So I've been talking to lots of organisations in manufacturing about how they adopt digital technology, how they transform their organisations. And during these conversations, I've come across people talking about job crafting. So today I'm delighted to be joined by two people who are passionate about job crafting. And opposite ends of the globe, has to be said. So in Australia, I have got Sara Howard, who is Senior Researcher at Flinders University in Adelaide. And on the other side of the world, I've got somebody much closer to home. I've got Professor Colin Lindsay, who is Professor of Work and Employment Studies within Strathclyde Business School. And they're both passionate about job crafting. So today I want to ask them some questions as somebody who is not a specialist in this field, but who is very interested in seeing, is it a tool we could use to help manufacturing companies become more effective and adopt digital technologies? So I'm going to start with a few questions. They'll probably ask each other things too, but I'm going to start with a question. And I know they're both really passionate about job crafting, but I want to understand, is there hard evidence that shows that job crafting actually helps organisations and helps individuals? So, Colin, I'm going to throw that one out to you first of all, and then we'll come to you next, Sara. But is there evidence that says job crafting is something powerful?
Good. Hi, Jill. Hi, Sarah. I think the simple answer to that is yes. Like any evidence base in the world of work and employment, the issues are complicated and context is really important. So job crafting will land and impact differently based on what kind of organization you're working in, the scale of that organization, the sector, the business model, and the people that you're working with. But the kind of underlying evidence and argument here is that we know that where people have what we might call resource-rich jobs, where they have challenging jobs, where they have jobs where they have access to the resources, the support, the people around them, the learning opportunities that help them to thrive in the workplace. We know that in those kind of jobs and in those kind of workplaces, people have the potential to be more engaged, more productive, more healthy, and more innovative. So we think that job crafting might be, and improving people's jobs, might be a really important solution in terms of improving people's engagement, well-being, and productivity in the workplace. I've talked already a little bit about what a good job looks like in terms of having the resources to do your job well. So when we think about how people's jobs impact on their well-being, their engagement, their productivity, their performance in the workplace, we often talk about the resources that they have available to them. So that's things like learning opportunities, feeling supported by your team and by your line manager, having the right technology in a digital manufacturing setting to get the job done as efficiently and innovatively as possible. But what happens when employees don't have access to the resources that they need to do the job well? Or what happens where people don't feel sufficiently challenged, they feel boxed in a standardized work environment? Well, managers can go around and business owners can go around trying to support people to improve their job from the top down. But what job crafting tries to do is to empower people to improve their work, their performance, their well-being, and their engagement from the bottom up. And we can talk a little bit more about what we mean by job crafting. But to go to your question about, do we have evidence that it makes a difference? We do have significant evidence that it makes a difference, including in the manufacturing sector. On our Interact website, we've got links to various examples and case studies from China, from India, from Indonesia, and even from the UK. Our own research on a previous UK research and innovation project I was involved in spoke to 1,300 employees across 7 manufacturers. And we were looking in those manufacturers, what was the key driver of innovation performance? And we asked both employees and managers about every conceivable aspect of work organisation and people management. The single consistently most mentioned aspect of work organisation that drove innovation performance was access to job crafting. So there is a significant and growing evidence base that in digital manufacturing and in many other workplaces, this might make a difference.
Great, Colin. Can I just ask before I move on to Sara? So, job crafting is about empowering people, but it's also about listening to people by the sounds of it. You were saying it's context specific. So, sometimes within an organisation, do you find that people's perceptions are different? The things they're looking for are different, even if they're in the same organisation?
Absolutely. And I think that's why job crafting can be a powerful solution. As I was saying, I think my diagnosis of where many manufacturing organizations and many organizations more generally fall foul is that they try to solve problems by managing people from the top down, essentially micromanaging people. And very often that can be a very well-meaning area of management practice that managers think it's their responsibility and their responsibility alone to diagnose problems and to go into micro units and teams and solve those problems. As you pointed out, Jill, problems, challenges, opportunities to innovate tend to be highly contextualized at the organizational level and even at the team level. So one of the great things about job crafting is saying the people on the front line probably have better information and better ideas about how to drive innovation and improve their own jobs from the bottom up. What job crafting does as an area of management practice is to essentially make it okay. It establishes a set of management practices and norms and ways of working where people on the front line understand that it's part of their job to take ownership, to take control, and to drive improved jobs and improve performance from the bottom up within a safe environment. And we can talk about how we manage risks within job crafting later in this discussion.
Colin, do you agree, Sara? Do you agree with what Colin's saying? And do you see the same evidence of better performance in your studies?
Yeah, I do. So I don't have, a large repertoire or database from our Australian context yet at this point from me personally, although there's been lots of studies come out of the University of Melbourne in particular, but I absolutely agree with the points that Colin has made. So job crafting is an example of work design or redesign, and there's a lot of literature that supports the benefits of good work design. So both the productivity and well-being components to that, and job crafting being that bottom-up job personalisation and customisation enhances a lot of those benefits. So it leads to greater engagement and productivity because it is so tailored to that person's strengths and interests. But I think what's particularly interesting to me, so there's been lots of meta-analyses and longitudinal studies around the extent and persistence of the benefits of job crafting, but I think overall it's probably greatly underestimated in studies and in workplaces because a lot of us probably do it naturally without realizing that we're doing it. So there's a lot of distinction around job crafting in the wild, they call it. So just kind of it's integrated into how you work naturally versus job crafting through an intervention where you've been skilled up to specifically identify where the gaps are to tweak your demands and your resources as Colin was saying. And I think the hard bit within that is that, we probably in our jobs, we sit on a spectrum possibly being forbidden to job craft, as in it's hard to work out where that wriggle room is to make tweaks, right through to where job crafting is almost expected within your role. So as an academic, highly autonomous, expected to, apply mastery, learn and develop. So I think, as Colin was saying, that context piece is what makes it really interesting and worth investigating in a range of industries and settings.
Really glad you said that, Sara, because you guys talk about job crafting. And I've often wondered whether people know they're doing job crafting or not. So coming from the manufacturing kind of sector, people talk about lean approaches, Six Sigma approaches, which are quite standard, accredited, approved. People talk about these kind of things. But they might not talk about job crafting in the same way. Am I right in thinking that?
Absolutely. And what's really interesting, and I think this is where we need to talk the language of the industries that we're working with. And so one of the lean, and I'm by no means an expert in lean, but part of that philosophy is zero waste, which includes of human time and skill. And so really job crafting sits in there because you're wanting to capitalize and utilize on someone's full abilities and take that bigger, more holistic approach, which brings everyone up, the individual, the team and the business, to achieve greater things. Colin, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great insight, Sarah, about the need to lean into the kind of, quite literally lean into some of the language that's familiar in the manufacturing setting. And I think you're both right to say that very often people do job crafting. It's almost like they don't know they're doing it. Many of the companies I work with in manufacturing and beyond, leader organizations will say, we knew this was kind of important, we just didn't know there was a name for it. But providing a name for it and a framing for it and a set of norms and practices can be really helpful in embedding job crafting within the existing practices that, as you point out, Jill and Sarah, have already assisted manufacturers to drive innovation and improve performance.
So we're going to shout about it more.
Well, just on that, Jill, jumping in, look, I completely agree. And I think, when we're interacting with industry, we have to be really careful how these things are presented. And I think, job crafting, people have different connotations with that. And some people actually think of, arts and craft, and they don't really understand it. And so often we've been talking about it in terms of improving adaptability. So one of the advantages of job crafting as a bottom-up work design kind of approach is the fact that it is more associated with improving people's coping skills with change. And so that's kind of the angle that we've really been trying to drive. And given all the uncertainty that we seem to constantly be experiencing these days, that's the real niche, I think, of job crafting, is that adaptability piece.
That probably leads to my next question, because I said at the start, I came into this because I was interested in helping manufacturing companies to adopt digital technologies. So it seems to me that job crafting, at the same time as you're thinking about adopting new ways of working and new technologies, makes sense. So again, is there any kind of advice that you would have, or any stories you would like to tell about how organisations have done the two at the same time? So, Sarah, do you want to start on that one, since you started that conversation there?
Sure. Thanks for that, Jill. Absolutely. So change is always an opportunity to do things differently and reassess ways of working. We have done a recent study of job crafting within manufacturing as part of my work with the Flinders Factory of the Future. And what we actually saw in terms of job crafting behaviour was that individual employees did report quite a high level of job crafting behaviour. So kind of engaging in it frequently to often. However, what we found was an interesting pattern where they were much more inclined to increase their structural job resources, so increasing their autonomy, their task variety, that skill development piece, whereas they were less likely to focus on that increasing social job resources. So it wasn't rare, it was still fairly common, but less inclined to reach out to supervisors, peers for support, coaching and feedback. And so how that links in with that digital piece is, it will be very interesting to see how digital technologies, robotics, AI and so forth influence how we job craft, because I think AI, for example, or technology, is providing us with feedback that may make us less inclined to need to reach out to a supervisor or a peer. And as an organisational psychologist, I have my own view about whether or not that's an improvement or not, but maybe I'll pause there and let Colin give his 2 cents.
Yeah, thanks, Sara. And I think those are really interesting nuances about how different forms of digital technology and different workplace practice might shape different approaches to job crafting. I think in general, though, Jill, your point is well made. We invest in digital transformation in manufacturing workplaces in the hope of certain wins, certain gains. And one of those is to help people to work more efficiently and to free them up to do more high value added tasks. And another is to connect people more, to help people to collaborate more. So those are the promises of digital transformation in the manufacturing workplace. The question would then become, what kind of job design and what kind of workplace practices help maximize the return to those kind of digital transformation investments? I think I would argue that putting practices in place that empower people to engage in job crafting is a really great fit. It really leans into the whole idea of trying to align agile working practices with investments in digital transformation so that we can really harness and maximize the benefits of the connectivity, the opportunities for innovation, and the efficiencies that digital transformation can bring. So in lots of the businesses we've worked with, we've identified spaces where manufacturing employees who've been empowered to engage in job crafting have won or gained access to the kind of learning and training resources that help them to maximize the potential of digital investments. We've identified examples where people have optimized, essentially found the efficiency, the maximizing the efficiency that is offered by digital investments in their day-to-day work. Very often these are micro changes that people are empowered to make at the front line, but can have really substantial gains for the company.
I guess we're all job crafting at the moment as we grapple with AI. I mean, as an academic, I am thinking about how can I use some of these tools, and it does change my day-to-day work. So no, I think it's a fascinating area.
But I think, Jill, just to jump in on to complete that loop, I think, it does. So job crafting is really trying to align strengths, interests, and needs between the individual and the job. So I think it probably speaks to that broader digital literacy piece, and how do we focus on people who don't naturally gravitate to digital technologies as much as others, despite all the anticipated benefits, and help them job craft to see the more positive side, I guess, of that situation, and ease their way into those changes.
Right, Sarah, and can I also just come back to when you were talking about the research that you did, you weren't actually asking people about the term job crafting, were you? When you were surveying people, you were using indicators of job crafting. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we use the job crafting scale by Timms et al., which adopts the job demands and resources model. So yes, it was, more specific and detailed. So we absolutely didn't lead with, do you job craft? For sure.
Just checking.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, Sarah and Jill. The first rule of job crafting is do not talk about job crafting. So those of us who engage in research in this space would ask people about how they work in their day-to-day job. So do they seek out additional learning opportunities or feedback? Do they seek additional challenge? Do they want to step up and take on new responsibilities and learn new things? Do they find ways to maximize efficiency in their day-to-day work? These are indicators of job crafting. The big question is what kind of management and workplace practices empower people to max out the opportunities to behave in those ways, because we know where they do, they will be more engaged or have the potential to be more engaged and innovative in the workplace.
Thanks, Colin. So if somebody is listening to this and thinks that sounds interesting, where do I start? So it might be a manager, it might be a supervisor, it might be a team leader, it might even just be an employee that says, I would like to think about how I job craft myself. Where would you point them to start looking into this? And probably, Colin, I'll come back to you. Is one of those, do we have to employ expensive consultants, or is it something you can go and find out on your own and just start doing?
Well, we would always encourage people to engage with the university community, not necessarily employing us expensively, maybe inexpensively. That's one way to do it. I think that we have resources on the Interact website, which will be helpful for businesses and individuals who want to learn more about job crafting. I think if I was a leader and in a manufacturing enterprise, the first thing I would think about is how not to micromanage people towards better innovation performance and better engagement, but to think about how we might empower people to do that themselves and what kind of practices and norms of working might help people to get there. And as we're saying, to some extent, manufacturing leaders have to work with their people to craft their own solutions because it is going to be highly contextualized. I think I mentioned earlier, one of the questions that I ask manufacturing leaders to think about is simply the question, is it okay? Have we put the practices in place where people think it's okay to craft better solutions from the bottom up in terms of their job? And have we put the support mechanisms in place to create that opportunity and to help people follow through on job crafting? And maybe to take a step back, I think we've alluded to some of the components and elements that go into job crafting, but in fact, it's really the way that I understand and think about job crafting is pretty simple. We talk about crafting for resources, crafting for challenge, and optimization. So that basically just means, in terms of crafting for resources, is it okay for people on the front line to seek out the learning, the support, the additional training, maybe the additional access to technology, the additional feedback that they need to do the job as effectively as possible? So that's crafting for job resources. So as a manager, I'd be thinking about the extent to which I've created norms and ways of working and communicated that idea to people on the front line, that it's okay to seek out those opportunities. And then, of course, I've got to follow through by making sure that the resources and opportunities, for instance, for learning or better feedback or better training opportunities are available to people. So that's part one, crafting for resources. Crafting for challenge is basically saying, is it okay for people to step up, to say, I want to do more, I want to learn more, I want to shadow a more senior colleague, I want to rotate into a different team so that I can learn boundary spanning skills? Is it okay for people to think that they can do that? And then can we support those kind of experiences for people? And then optimization is essentially saying, if you've got demands in your job that are limiting your ability to perform, driving you crazy because you've got some inefficiencies in the process, is it okay to seek out a solution from the bottom up? So for managers, you've got to ask yourself if you created the context and the opportunity set for people to think it's okay to make those improvements from the bottom up. It's not easy, but if you start asking those questions, you might arrive at some practices that support people to engage in job crafting.
So, Colin, just following up on that, I've attended some of the sessions you've run around job crafting with organisations. So I think what you're saying there is you can start with kind of activities with your staff, but ultimately you're looking to have it's not just an event, it is a long-term building that right environment. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. I mean, I talk about the opportunity set a lot. In my world of HR research, we often talk about the A, the M, and the O of people performing in the workplace. People need to have the ability, the motivation, and the opportunity. And all of three of those in digital manufacturing, all of those are important. We need people properly skilled. So that's the ability bit. We need the incentives for people to perform. So that's the motivation bit. But as I often say to businesses, I'm an O guy, because I think the A and the M in many manufacturing settings are rather easier to achieve than the O bit. Creating the opportunity for people to think it's okay for them to solve problems from the bottom up can be really challenging in any business, but we know that if managers put the practices in place, put the resources in place to support people to craft solutions safely and to manage risk, and again, we might come back to that, it's important to manage risk, then those opportunity sets, putting those practices in place to reinforce that the opportunity is there, might be the most important thing that managers can do to help people drive job crafting.
That's great, Colin. You just got to watch that. I'm an old guy. I thought you said I'm an old guy there for a moment.
Both can be true at the same time.
Sarah, obviously in Australia, people aren't going to knock on Colin's door in Glasgow. What kind of advice would you give to people in Australia who are looking to start job crafting? Would you say anything different to what Colin said there?
Probably just a bit more general and simplified. I think, as always, Colin makes some excellent points. From a manager perspective, we know working in workplaces and in human resources and so on and fields like that, culture is so important to so many things. And so, the opposite of uncertainty is not certainty, but it's openness. So having an open-minded manager, workplace, culture, managers who role model the desirable behaviours. Colin touched on the M word, micromanager, really deflating on a range of levels. I'm sure we've all had a micromanager or two in our careers. The psychologist in me also wants to, fly a flag for psychological safety. So that's cultural as well. So making sure that people feel comfortable flagging issues and concerns, admitting when they've made a mistake, and being that learning organisation to do things better next time around. I think for individuals, really for me, it comes down to knowing what drains you and what energizes you in your job, and exploring with your manager, but independently first, how you can amplify the things that energize you, and how can you, and Colin touched on managing risk, how can you decrease or change, craft the elements of your role that drain you, without obviously adding to other people's workloads or causing issues.
I think that's great. And I think that's recognising that people in teams have got different views of things and different skill sets. So use it. Yeah, lean into it. Okay, great.
And I think, and I just want to add, sorry, Jill, that, I think taking time out to problem solve collectively from that bottom up perspective is so important. And we've had examples of people in Australia sharing how difficult it has been to retain employees, and one company couldn't find a delivery driver for love nor money. They were a small company building sheds, and so part of job crafting and that bottom-up solution is a bit of cognitive reframing. And so how can you present and integrate delivering sheds and attach that with other elements of their job that they enjoy? So you're solving a business problem, but you're also, leveraging people's strengths and interests.
Thanks for that, Sarah. Right. Okay, last question I think I've got goes back to some of the research you've been doing. So I know you've both been doing surveys, more in-depth studies in this area. And really, I'm going to turn to Colin first and ask, what are the kind of headlines that you're seeing in the investigations you've been doing in the UK largely, Colin?
Okay, thanks, Jill. I think Sarah and I need to throw some more jargon at the audience at this point, but I'm afraid it's unavoidable because, as I understand it, we've both been interested in the relationship between what happens in the workplace, including around job crafting, and a thing called dynamic capabilities. So let's spend 1 minute defining what we mean by dynamic capabilities, and Sarah can correct me if I go wrong, and then I'll talk a little bit about some research we've been doing at Strathclyde around dynamic capabilities in manufacturing. So maybe 30 years ago, in the midst of globalization, economists led by David Teese, a scholar in the US, and lots of other people were interested at the same time, were interested in why, under the pressures of globalization and technological transformation, do some organizations fail, others seem to thrive and manage to innovate their way out of crisis. And to cut a long story short, the end of that research endeavor was to say that businesses that are able to innovate and pivot and thrive in crisis have access to something called dynamic capabilities. What do we mean by that? Well, every business has access to ordinary capabilities, their plant, their stock, their technology, their people, their supply chains. What these scholars were arguing was that organizations that have dynamic capabilities have a kind of unique capacity to sense, seize, and reconfigure and transform their business. What do we mean by that? We mean they have the apparatus to sense opportunities and threats, whether that's transformative technology, new products emerging, new markets emerging, new competitors. So they have that sensory apparatus to identify opportunities and threats for the business. They then have sufficient agility built into the business to seize those opportunities or to take action against those threats. And that might mean reskilling people or retailing your equipment or adopting new technology and getting that technology transferred across the business. And then lastly, those businesses have the opportunity to, the ability to reconfigure and transform their operations. And we've seen lots of examples of that during the COVID-19 crisis, where really successful businesses completely ripped apart their business model and reconfigured it to do something else instead. Sensing, seizing, reconfiguring, we call these dynamic capabilities. And we think that businesses that are able to pivot and innovate their way out of crisis seem to have access to those capabilities. Okay, thank you for listening. So the next question then is, what kind of workplace practices might be associated with firms that have those dynamic capabilities? This is potentially quite an under-researched area of work. Our colleagues who are interested in dynamic capabilities mainly come from an economics or organizational studies perspective, less people-oriented. There is some interesting research on the relationship between HR and people and work and dynamic capabilities, but I would argue there needs to be much more. And as a result of that, you and I, Jill, as you know, conducted with colleagues and partners a survey of more than 300 manufacturing leaders in the UK. And amongst other things, we were trying to explore this link between businesses that self-report having these dynamic capabilities, the capacity to sense, seize, and reconfigure how they do their business, and the kind of workplace practices, and especially workplace innovation practices, that we think might be really important in terms of empowering people to drive innovation in their businesses. So that was the link that we were trying to explore into those three manufacturing leaders. What did we find? Well, first, let's do some caveats. These are self-reported data, so there is a same source bias challenge, and it's a snapshot, so we don't have any kind of longitudinal performance data. So we're not claiming any causality here. We're just looking for relationships between workplace practice and self-reported dynamic capabilities. But here's the good news. From our survey research and the statistical analysis we conducted, there did seem to be a link between self-reporting of we do, as a business, have the ability to sense these opportunities and threats, to seize opportunities and to change how we do things, and a push to reconfigure how we run the business. So there seems to be a relationship between those dynamic capabilities and place practices that aren't particularly far away from the kind of job crafting discussions that we've just had. So those kind of dynamic capabilities were more often found in businesses that also practice distributed leadership. So that's basically empowering people at all parts of the business to take on leadership responsibility and leadership roles. They had strong team collaboration mechanisms, both within and across teams. And they had, within the normal bounds of management practice, strong self-organization structures and processes. So the kind of workplace innovation practices that we find in some, but by no means all, manufacturers seem to be associated with those organizations having dynamic capabilities. So if we think we're right, that dynamic capabilities are really important to businesses trying to manage their way through crisis, and as we already alluded to in this discussion, crisis doesn't seem to be going anywhere fast. So if you're trying to manage your way through and innovate out of crisis, these kind of workplace practices around empowering teams, around supporting collaboration, around self-organization and supporting people to solve problems from the bottom up, getting back to job crafting, those kind of workplace practices might be really important.
Thanks, Colin. And I mean, it's funny, isn't it? The different languages of different disciplines. I mean, what you're saying kind of ties in with where I'm at, where I talk about organizations that encourage entrepreneurial mindset. You know, encourage people to not start businesses, but to be active, to look for opportunity, you know, to take action. And I think that's exactly what you're saying without putting that label of job crafting around it. And sometimes you walk into an organisation and, as you rightly say, you can just feel that they're able to do that, and they're able to sense change and do something with it, you know, take the opportunities or pivot if necessary. So, no, thanks very much, Colin. Over to you, Sara. Like, you've probably forgotten what the question was, but I was really asking about the research that you've been doing. You know, what are the big takeaways? What are you seeing, and what are the things that you think are interesting paths that you might look at in the future, for example?
Sure. Yeah. Look, I think it's a neat segue from what Colin was talking about, and I think I completely agree. There is a risk of overloading people with talking about so many concepts, and so part of what we're interested in is actually trying to identify the conceptual alignment between dynamic capabilities and job crafting, for example. So part of our survey work, so the same caveats apply to our survey data that Colin raised before. Part of that survey work asked individuals about their job crafting behaviours, as well as their engagement with the sensing, seizing, transforming behaviour at an individual level. And so what we're both dynamic capabilities and job crafting have a degree of proactive behaviour required to do it, and they're both concerned with changing, adapting to optimise resources. So what we've found from our data is there is a moderate to strong relationship between job crafting and dynamic capabilities at an individual level, and you might be thinking, oh, this is too much, why should I care about this, just pick one and be done with it. It's important because it offers different levers for individuals and businesses to improve wellbeing and productivity. So we have a productivity challenge in Australia. We have sustained low productivity growth. I think the UK is in the same boat, Canada, and a lot of other economies. So the more things that we can identify to change and improve, the better off business and the economy is going to be in general.
Thanks, Sarah. And yes, I think we've got very similar challenges across the globe. Yeah. Before we finish today, we are going to put this on the Interact website. We'll put other resources around job crafting if people want to access that. But is there anything you would like to point people to immediately? Any resources or your own activity perhaps you're doing at Flinders or Factory of the Future, Sarah, or likewise at Strathclyde, Colin? Before we leave, is there anywhere you would like people to go look other than the Interact website?
Well, I'll make a quick plug for Flinders Factory of the Future. So we are kind of in the early development establishment phase, but we have a LinkedIn page and a website. So if you're keen, we do a whole range of activities, both engineering and more technically oriented, as well as the organisational psychology and human factors approaches. So they're probably good places to check out, but we are adding content to those websites, but it's a little bit of drip feeding at the moment.
Thanks, Sarah. Anything you want to add, Colin?
I think just to keep an eye on our Interact LinkedIn and webpage, because as you know, Jill, we'll be continuing to post emerging analysis on there. I'm also going to do a little plug for an additional job crafting project that covers manufacturing and many other sectors I'm involved with, called the NIHR Wishes project. Don't ask me to remember what Wishes stands for, but if you go to wishes.uk.com, you'll find more resources. Wishes is, as we understand, the world's largest randomized control trial of a job crafting intervention. So in this case, we'll be going into companies, essentially training people and managers how to do job crafting. We spoke earlier about many people do it already, or all they need is a language and a framing to help understand that they're doing it. But we can also train it, or at least we're going to try. So with Wishes, we'll be doing a randomized control trial. We'll be training some people in teams in job crafting. Others will be part of our control group. And then we're going to go back and analyse the extent to which job crafting can have an impact on well-being, on managing health conditions, especially in the workplace, which is a big challenge in many manufacturing establishments that have perhaps an ageing workforce, but also its impact on innovation and productivity. So that's something we're really excited about, and we look forward to taking forward and reporting on in due course.
That's great. Thanks very much, Colin. And thanks to both of you. Thanks, Colin, for getting up early in Glasgow. And thank you, Sarah, for staying late in Australia. It's been a great conversation, and I'm sure we'll have many more. But thanks for just now. Thank you.
Until next time. Thanks, Jill. Thanks, Colin.
See ya. Bye-bye.